January 1942. A narrow attic room above a bakery in occupied Paris trembles with the distant rumble of a passing German convoy. Frost gathers along the inside of the fragile window pane, and the weak glow of a single candle paints long shadows across the uneven wooden floorboards. At a small table sits a young British-trained courier, her breath steady but shallow, her fingers hovering over what looks like a child's plaything, an absurdly small, almost toy-like camera no larger than a matchbox. Outside, the echo of boots on cobblestone grows louder, drifting up the stairwell with the cold night air. She lifts the tiny device to the edge of the curtain, just wide enough to reveal the rail yard below, where German trucks idle in formation beneath dim lamps. One click, then another. The shutter is barely a whisper, lost in the hum of engines and shouted orders. She pockets the toy as the footsteps pause right outside her door, the wooden frame trembling. That small camera, dismissed by most as a novelty or child's gadget, was about to alter the flow of intelligence in occupied Europe, and its story begins long before this frozen night. The story of Britain's miniature spy cameras begins not in the quiet rooms of occupied Europe, but in the chaotic months that followed one of the greatest collapses in modern military history. By June 1940, France had fallen in just 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped only by abandoning its equipment on the beaches of Dunkirk, and by autumn, the Luftwaffe's bombers were striking London nightly. Britain stood alone against a continent swallowed by Nazi occupation. Yet even as the threat of invasion loomed, London faced a problem more subtle and equally dangerous. The country had suddenly become blind. Across Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Denmark, and Norway, German troops moved with speed and discipline, building command centers, fortifying coasts, and rerouting entire rail systems to feed the war in the east. British command could no longer rely on diplomats or travelers for information. There were no diplomats left, and anyone traveling through occupied Europe was treated with suspicion. Without eyes on the continent, Britain had no way to predict German troop movements, supply lines, or the fortification of Atlantic ports. It was a blackout of intelligence that threatened every decision the War Office needed to make. To address this growing darkness, London created 2 organizations that would redefine clandestine warfare. MI9 was formed to help Allied airmen escape from occupied territories and to support resistance networks with maps, gadgets, and contact systems. Alongside it, the Special Operations Executive, SOE, was tasked with a far more aggressive purpose: sabotage, subversion, and the quiet nurturing of resistance movements across Europe. Both agencies relied on human intelligence in a way the British military had never needed before. They required couriers who could blend into city streets, agents who could enter a workshop or train station unnoticed, and ordinary civilians who could pass vital details across the channel without ever appearing to be part of a covert machine. But while MI9 and SOE could train brave men and women to move through occupied cities, they still lacked a tool capable of gathering the detail London required. Photography had played a role in intelligence since the First World War, but traditional cameras were now dangerous liabilities. Standard 35mm devices were too bulky, too conspicuous, and far too obvious during German searches. Patrols routinely checked civilians' pockets and luggage for radios, weapons, and concealed documents. Even a mid-sized camera would trigger interrogation or arrest. Yet the information London needed, bridge structures, rail switches, troop insignia, dockside loading patterns, demanded visual evidence. A courier could memorize the number of fuel trucks in a bay, but only photographs could reveal the type of fuel lines, the placement of guards, or the markings on supply crates. Air reconnaissance could paint the large picture, but it could not peer into workshops, examine factory doors, or read notices pinned to a station wall. Ground intelligence was indispensable, but only if it could be gathered safely. This tension pushed British engineers toward an unusual idea. Long before the war, miniature novelty cameras had existed as affordable curiosities, tiny devices marketed to hobbyists or children, often producing low-quality images but admired for their compactness. They were sold in shops as amusing gadgets, sometimes given as inexpensive souvenirs or promotional items. On their own, they were hardly tools of espionage. Their lenses were small, their shutters fragile, their film format limited. Yet when the first SOE and MI9 officers examined them, they saw something far more valuable. These little cameras did not look threatening. They did not resemble professional equipment. A German patrolman, accustomed to searching for coded notes or full-size cameras, would never suspect that a toy-like trinket could be capable of gathering intelligence. This misperception was the weapon. By late 1940, as the Blitz raged over London and Britain fought for survival, the concept began to solidify. If British craftsmen could enhance the mechanical precision of these miniature devices, strengthen their shutters, reduce noise, and refine their optics, all while preserving the outward appearance of a cheap novelty, agents could carry them without fear. They could be placed inside coat pockets, hidden in sewing kits, or passed off as children's items during searches. The idea required careful engineering, meticulous testing, and an understanding of how real agents moved under pressure. The risk of failure was enormous. A jammed shutter, a faint image, or a cracked lens could cost a courier her life. But if it worked, this toy could pierce the darkness enveloping Europe. Thus, in small workshops across Britain, the first steps were taken toward transforming a simple curiosity into a clandestine weapon. And as engineers began to study these tiny cameras with fresh eyes, the challenge ahead grew clear. Turning a civilian novelty into a reliable instrument of war would require far more than just shrinking the machinery. The transformation of miniature cameras from harmless novelties into instruments of espionage began in quiet British workshops far from the front lines. Before the war, Europe had already seen a fascination with compact photography. Subminiature cameras, some barely larger than a matchbox, were sold in department stores as curios or clever gifts. They were often marketed to hobbyists who enjoyed experimentation rather than serious photographers. Their construction varied widely. Some were cheaply stamped from light metal, others crafted with surprising precision despite their tiny size. Though their images were small and sometimes grainy, they had one advantage that wartime engineers could not ignore. They were forgettable. No German patrolman would seize a miniature novelty camera when more suspicious items demanded attention. That invisibility became the foundation for their evolution into covert tools. By late 1940, British intelligence officers from MI9 and SOE began quietly collecting these various subminiature models, studying them like puzzle pieces. If a small lens could be brightened, if a shutter could be quieted, if exposure controls could be simplified to the point where an agent could use the camera in a dim corridor or crowded station without error, the device could become far more than a toy. Engineers from small optical firms, many of whom had backgrounds in civilian photography, joined the effort. Their workshops, rooms filled with hand tools, magnifiers, brass fittings, and mechanical parts, became the hidden birthplace of a new form of intelligence gathering. These craftsmen were not soldiers, but their work would influence the battlefield all the same. The challenges were immediate and unforgiving. Early miniature models often suffered from light leaks around the film compartment, a fatal flaw for images taken under low light conditions. Their shutters, designed for casual daylight photography, produced faint but noticeable clicks, sounds that might go unheard in a bustling street, but became dangerous in a silent office or storage room. Film threading was delicate, requiring careful handling that a nervous agent under surveillance might struggle to perform. Worst of all, the small lenses captured limited detail. If a courier risked her life to photograph a German rail schedule or a factory notice, the image had to be readable once developed in London. Failure was not just inconvenient. It could mean the loss of critical intelligence or the death of the agent. To overcome this, British engineers began experimenting with reinforced internal plates to prevent light leaks, ultralight shutters that produced only the faintest whisper, and simplified internal mechanisms that allowed the film to advance with minimal movement. Many of the improvements were invisible on the surface, preserving the toy-like exterior. A miniature camera might still look like a souvenir bought at a seaside kiosk. Yet inside it held precision parts milled by skilled craftsmen working under wartime urgency. The goal was not to create the best camera, but the most plausible one, something that could live in an agent's pocket without drawing a second glance. As these improvements progressed, field testing became essential. MI9 and SOE trainers handed prototype devices to recruits undergoing covert operations training. In mock checkpoints, instructors searched trainees aggressively, emptying their pockets onto wooden tables under harsh lamps. Cheap-looking objects, comb cases, pencil sharpeners, matchboxes, trinkets were pushed aside with disinterest. The toy cameras consistently passed unnoticed. But in controlled exercises simulating real missions, the weaknesses of each prototype emerged. Some models produced frames too small to reveal meaningful detail. Others fogged easily when carried close to the body on humid nights. Shutter stuck in cold weather. Film jammed during quick reloading drills. Every flaw recorded became a design note passed back to the workshops. Yet the essence of the idea endured. Disguise was as vital as engineering. A camera that looked too refined risked suspicion. But one that looked cheap, even worthless, gained safety from neglect. SOE handlers often remarked that German soldiers rarely paid attention to objects that held no military value. A small toy camera, especially one with an unassuming plastic or stamped metal exterior, was the perfect deception. Agents could carry them in coat pockets, sewing kits, children's satchels, or innocuous cosmetic pouches. The camera's size and trivial appearance became its shield. By 1941, small batches of improved miniature cameras began appearing in MI9 supply crates destined for resistance networks and SOE teams across Europe. They were never produced in large numbers, partly because secrecy demanded limited distribution and partly because the work remained labor-intensive. Each device was adjusted, tested, and prepared by hand, but their impact was growing. Each successful mission, each sharp image developed in a London laboratory, reinforced the value of this improbable tool. The War Office, once skeptical of toy gadgets, now understood that these tiny cameras solved a problem no other device could address. They enabled close-range intelligence where large cameras or airborne reconnaissance could not reach. And as British engineers refined the design, they also began to recognize that the camera was only one part of a larger equation. The device's true power lay not solely in its mechanics, but in the many human and tactical angles that determined how it would be used in the field. The miniature camera's effectiveness rested on far more than clever engineering. Its true power emerged only when placed into the hands of the people who carried it into danger. For the agents and couriers operating inside occupied Europe, every movement was measured, every gesture controlled, and every mistake potentially fatal. The camera had to function not in calm, laboratory conditions, but in dim stairwells, crowded train stations, and rooms where silence could mean survival. Understanding the human and tactical angles behind its use reveals why British engineers worked so relentlessly to refine a device that looked so innocent. It was never just a camera. It was a lifeline, a messenger, and in many cases, the final piece of truth an agent captured before disappearing into the machinery of occupation. For the agents who risked everything behind enemy lines, the most important requirement of the miniature camera was ease of use. Many were not seasoned operatives, but civilians, teachers, students, postal clerks, given crash course training in photography before being sent into the field. Their hands would tremble not from inexperience, but from the constant awareness that a German patrol could appear at any moment. The device had to work in darkness, by touch alone, with no need for precise focusing or complicated settings. British instructors trained recruits to use the camera while keeping their eyes fixed on the door, never the lens. A single button, a quick win to the film, and the shot was taken. That simplicity was not a luxury, but a necessity. In a cramped attic overlooking a railway depot or in a dim corridor behind a factory, agents rarely had the time or safety to adjust anything. The camera needed to become an extension of their own instincts quiet, fast, and reliable. And when fear threatened to overwhelm them, its harmless appearance offered a strange comfort. In a world of rifles, boots, and barking orders, holding something that looked like a toy felt almost human. That sense of normalcy steadied hands and nerves when nothing else could. Occupied European cities were shaped by a rhythm of constant interruption. German soldiers patrolled streets at all hours, stopping civilians with little provocation, demanding papers, opening bags, and inspecting anything that seemed out of place. Parisians, Belgians, Danes, and Dutch citizens learned to move with their heads down, their belongings arranged in predictable ways to avoid suspicion. Cameras, however, were a different matter. A civilian caught carrying a traditional camera near a restricted area, rail yards, ports, bridges, invited immediate questioning. German patrols were keenly aware that photography could be used to gather intelligence, and regulations in many cities explicitly restricted or banned public photography. This made any obvious camera a liability. But the miniature device, disguised as a toy, threaded the narrowest of gaps. A soldier rummaging through a pocket full of mundane items, coins, tickets, a handkerchief, perhaps a trinket, would instinctively dismiss the small object as worthless. Toy-like items were beneath suspicion. They carried no military significance. The camera's safety lay not in its concealment, but in its insignificance. It wasn't hidden, it simply didn't matter. And that psychological blind spot, repeated across thousands of inspections, became one of the most effective shields any British agent ever carried. Technical constraints shaped the camera's field use as much as human factors. Subminiature film, often in 16mm or similar formats, captured only tiny images, meaning agents needed to get close to whatever they intended to photograph. A document on a clerk's desk, a timetable at a train station, a signboard in a restricted port area. These targets demanded proximity. That closeness carried risk, but the small camera's silent operation made it possible. In low light, however, the challenges multiplied. Street lamps were dim, blackout curtains dulled interiors, and patrols often moved in near darkness. Engineers compensated by improving lens brightness and reducing shutter noise, but agents still had to choose their moments carefully. Many waited for the rumble of a passing truck or the hiss of a steam vent to mask their actions. The film, too, had to be handled with care. Some miniature negatives were delicate. A single crease or grain of dust could ruin an entire mission's worth of intelligence. Yet despite these limitations, the small camera excelled where larger devices failed. It enabled close-range documentation of details that aircraft could never see, insignia on crates, lock mechanisms on warehouse doors, repair patterns on locomotives. In a war where precision mattered, even a blurred frame could reveal enough to sharpen Allied strategy. By the end of 1941, all these human and tactical considerations had shaped the miniature camera into a tool uniquely suited to the dangerous corridors of occupied Europe. But to fully understand its evolution, the next layer lies deeper still, in the engineering brilliance behind its construction, the disguises that protected it, and the blind spots in German security that allowed it to survive. While the human and tactical realities shaped how the miniature camera was used in the field, its deeper strength came from the engineers and craftsmen who built it. Their work existed in a world of small tolerances, hidden mechanisms, and misdirection. The device's survival depended as much on clever construction and psychological camouflage as it did on the courage of those carrying it. And beneath every successful photograph taken in a dim railway office or behind a blackout curtain was an entire philosophy of engineering rooted in deception, precision, and an understanding of the enemy's habits. In the workshops where Britain's covert tools were forged, the miniature camera was treated not as a novelty, but as an intricate mechanical problem. Engineers had to maintain the outward appearance of a cheap, mass-produced trinket while quietly transforming its interior into something far more capable. This meant rebuilding shutters so light that their movement produced almost no sound, sometimes no more than a soft snap masked by a door closing down the hall. The frame had to be strong enough to withstand travel in pockets and bags without bending, yet light enough to preserve the illusion of insignificance. Precision milling was done by hand, often under magnifying lenses, with craftsmen shaving fractions of millimeters off components to ensure smooth operation. These engineers worked long hours under blackout conditions, creating tiny parts for a device no enemy was meant to notice. Their reality was one of careful trade-offs, strengthened too much, and the camera looks expensive, refined too little, and it fails in the field. Each camera became a quiet partnership between ingenuity and humility, brilliant on the inside, trivial on the outside. The true brilliance of the camera lay not only in its construction, but in its disguise. British intelligence understood that no matter how advanced the internal mechanism became, the camera's survival depended on its ability to blend into everyday life. That meant crafting a cover story into the object itself. Some miniature cameras were given bright, cheap-looking casings that resembled tourist souvenirs or children's toys. Others were disguised in mundane objects, small tins, matchbox-like shells, or clunky designs that suggested they were inexpensive novelties rather than precision instruments. The goal was psychological. Nothing about the camera should invite curiosity. Even the finishing touches mattered. A poorly stamped logo, a slightly uneven seam, or a flimsy latch could make the object look harmless. British handlers trained agents not only in how to use the camera, but how to present it if found. A child's gift, a silly keepsake, or a broken toy were all believable excuses. German patrols, burdened by real military priorities, rarely questioned such stories. The disguise worked because it catered to assumptions. Occupying forces expected sophistication and espionage, not simplicity. In that gap between expectation and reality, the camera lived safely. German security forces were thorough, but their training focused on specific threats. They were taught to look for coded notes, suspicious maps, forged documents, radios, weapons, or full-size cameras capable of reconnaissance. Their searches were methodical but purpose-driven. They wanted to find something that matched their idea of espionage. A miniature toy-like object fell completely outside that mental framework. Patrols would empty pockets onto tables, sorting valuables from clutter, and instinctively brush aside anything that lacked obvious purpose. A comb was a comb. A lipstick was a lipstick. A cheap trinket was just that, cheap. The miniature camera exploited a blind spot inherent in human judgment. People underestimate objects that appear childish or worthless. German soldiers routinely confiscated radios, binoculars, and film rolls, but they almost never seized trinkets or novelty gadgets. Even when a miniature camera was examined, its simple appearance made it unthreatening. It lacked the weight, polish, and presence of a professional device. To the Germans, it was beneath suspicion. That oversight became one of the quiet triumphs of British intelligence strategy. It wasn't brute force or superior technology that kept the camera safe. It was the enemy's own assumptions. Together, these engineering, psychological, and enemy-side factors formed the final layer of the miniature camera's evolution. It was not just a product of mechanical refinement, but a weapon built upon misdirection, one that thrived because it lived outside the expectations of those trying to find it. And when all these angles converged, they set the stage for the camera's greatest test, being carried into enemy territory on a mission where success or failure would hinge on a few silent frames of film. The miniature camera reached the height of its purpose not in the workshops where it was built, nor in the classrooms where agents learned to operate it, but in the tense, breathless moments of an actual mission deep inside occupied Europe. By 1942, the Allies urgently needed precise information on German transport networks, particularly the railway lines feeding troops, armor, and fuel toward the Eastern Front. Aerial reconnaissance could reveal the broad movements of trains and convoys, but could not uncover the finer details: repair schedules pinned to depot walls, markings on freight wagons, or the arrangement of guards controlling critical junctions. That level of intelligence required a person on the ground, and for that, British handlers chose a courier whose quiet confidence and unassuming appearance made her ideal for slipping through German scrutiny. Her journey began in a nondescript safe house in southern England, where she received a sealed package containing the miniature camera, spare film, forged travel documents, and a simple cover story. She was a textile buyer making trips between French towns in search of wool suppliers. The cover was plausible enough to withstand casual questioning, yet ordinary enough to avoid deeper interest. In that dimly lit room, an instructor demonstrated the final details of the camera. He placed it in her hand, letting her feel its feather-light weight, then guided her thumb across the tiny shutter lever. "Never look at it when you use it," he reminded her. "Look at the door. Look at your escape route. This device must work without thought." She practiced until the movement felt natural, each click blending into the background noise of the safe house. Only when she could operate it without glancing downward did the handler nod. The next morning, before dawn, she boarded a small fishing vessel bound for the French coast. Crossing into occupied France meant encountering the first, and often most dangerous, barrier, the frontier patrols. Her card of textiles, forged purchase receipts, and travel passes were convincing, but it was her manner that mattered most. At a checkpoint near Rouen, German soldiers inspected travelers with impatience sharpened by months of resistance activity in the region. She stood quietly as a guard rummaged through her belongings. He lifted the miniature camera and examined it, turning it in his gloved hand as though expecting it to reveal something. But its crude exterior, the slightly uneven edges, the cheap-looking metal casing, made it appear no more threatening than a souvenir one might buy for a child. With a snort of disinterest, he tossed it back into the satchel. Her heartbeat slowed. The device had already earned its keep. Days later, she reached the outskirts of a critical railway hub feeding material toward Germany's front lines. The resistance had arranged a room above a watchmaker's shop where she could observe the depot from a narrow attic window. The room smelled of old oil and dust. Light filtered through warped shutters and thin, trembling bands. She waited until the late afternoon, when workers filed through the yard and locomotives shifted along the tracks with slow groans. Her mission was simple in description, yet perilous in execution. Capture images of the repair sheds, freight cars, and guard rotations, details impossible to identify from aerial heights. She approached the window cautiously, lifting one slat just enough to reveal the scene below. Each movement of her fingers felt amplified, every sound threatening to betray her. The miniature camera, nestled in her palm, was almost absurdly small against the vast machinery rumbling beneath her. She braced her wrist against the frame, exhaled softly, and clicked the shutter. The sound was nearly imperceptible, lost in the clank of couplings and the hiss of steam. She wound the film gently, watching for shadows of patrolling guards along the fence line. Another shot, then another. She captured the timing of security rounds, the numbering system on wagons, and the pattern of workers entering the sheds, details that could help Allied planners estimate repair capacity and throughput. As daylight faded, she took one final photograph of a notice pinned to a storage shed, a maintenance schedule outlining locomotive rotations. It was the kind of detail that, once analyzed in London, could help predict when certain supply trains would be under repair, vulnerable, or in transit. She lowered the slat, wrapped the camera in cloth, and prepared to leave. But the mission was only half complete. Photographs remained useless until the film reached British hands. She knew the next hours would be the most dangerous. A contingency plan existed. If she was stopped, she was to give up the camera without protest, relying on its disguise to shield her. But the exposed film, tucked into the hem of her coat, could never fall into German hands. As she stepped down the creaking attic stairs, each sound seemed to echo too loudly. Voices drifted from below, German patrolmen checking shops and questioning owners. She steadied her breath. Everything depended on maintaining the calm facade of a civilian buyer finishing an ordinary errand. Her escape from the depot district marked the first step in the long journey the film would take. If she reached her contact, the tiny negatives would soon be carried, disguised within an ordinary envelope, across a network of couriers and resistance safe houses. From there, they would travel toward the coast, then across the Channel, finally reaching London's intelligence laboratories, where the images captured by her trembling hands would be enlarged, analyzed, and transformed into actionable strategy. And as she walked into the lengthening shadows of the occupied city, the true weight of the mission shifted from her shoulders to the small strip of film hidden beneath her coat, film that would soon guide decisions far beyond the streets she now crossed. The journey of the exposed film from occupied France to the intelligence rooms of London was itself a battle against time, suspicion, and the ever-tightening grip of German counterintelligence. Once the courier handed the tiny roll to her resistance contact, a factory foreman posing as a cooperative collaborator, the film vanished into a chain of hands, each link forged through secrecy and trust. The foreman tucked the film inside a hollowed-out fountain pen, a disguise so ordinary that it had passed across German desks countless times before. From there, a teenage cyclist carried it through fields and back roads to avoid patrols on main routes. The curved metal tube bounced lightly in the cyclist's jacket pocket, its importance invisible to everyone he passed. At dusk, he delivered it to a farmhouse attic where a radio operator waited, sorting coded messages destined for London. But unlike radio signals, the film could not be transmitted. It had to be physically carried out of France. And that challenge lay at the heart of the intelligence war. From the attic, the film traveled south in the lining of a merchant's coat, concealed so perfectly that even a close inspection revealed only the usual frayed stitching of wartime clothing. German checkpoints along the roads searched for weapons, ration violations, and forged papers, not microscopic negatives hidden inside a garment. The merchant crossed into the unoccupied zone under the pretense of sourcing materials for factory repairs, a claim believable enough to avoid prolonged questioning. In Marseille, through coded exchanges whispered in cafes and backrooms, he delivered the film to a courier with experience navigating the labyrinth of escape routes toward neutral Spain. The courier, a wiry man with the posture of someone who had never once trusted the street behind him, waited until midnight before beginning the mountain crossing. The film's journey through the Pyrenees was perilous. Snow clung to the peaks, wind howled through narrow passes, and patrols roamed the base paths looking for both smugglers and fugitives. But under the cover of darkness and the guidance of a local shepherd who knew every hidden trail, the courier climbed higher, each step carrying the precious intelligence closer to Allied hands. By the time he reached Barcelona, exhausted and frostbitten, the film he carried had survived more danger than most weapons ever would. At the British consulate, he handed it over with no ceremony, just a nod from the official who recognized the stitching pattern that concealed the tiny roll. Within days, the film was sealed in diplomatic pouch and flown to England aboard a neutral aircraft whose crew never learned what they carried. In London, the film entered a world of white coats, red lamps, and darkroom chemicals. Analysts from the photographic interpretation unit gathered around the tiny negatives, handling them with delicate tools as though they were rare specimens. In the dim glow of the darkroom, the images emerged, small, faint, but loaded with detail. Enlarging the frames required precision. Subminiature film did not forgive errors. Slowly, the ghostly shapes sharpened into the features of the German railway depot, the numbering on freight wagons, the shadowed openings of repair sheds, the pattern of guard movements across the yard. One frame captured the maintenance schedule she had risked everything to photograph. Another revealed the type of fuel drums stored near the tracks, indicating upcoming supply movements. Yet another showed an arrangement of tool carts beside a locomotive, evidence of a specific repair cycle that would soon leave certain engines out of service. The analysts compared these images with aerial photographs taken days earlier. The combination painted a fuller picture than either source could achieve alone. The Luftwaffe's camouflage nets, barely visible from above, were betrayed by the patterns seen on the ground. The movement of guards matched shifts recorded by resistance observers. The repair shed's interior, invisible to aircraft, revealed clues about the number of engines undergoing overhaul. All this formed a mosaic that allowed Allied planners to predict when particular trains would be in transit, when they would be vulnerable, and when bombing raids or sabotage missions would yield maximum effect. The tiny camera, dismissed as a toy by German patrols, had just provided the missing fragments of a strategic puzzle that reshaped British understanding of enemy logistics. Within weeks, Allied planners adjusted operations based directly on the intelligence gleaned from the photographs. Bombing raids targeted fuel convoys scheduled according to the maintenance timetable photographed in the depot yard. Resistance teams disrupted rail lines at moments when the German transport system was most strained. Even factory production estimates shifted as analysts used the images to assess the throughput of locomotives. The miniature camera's contribution was quiet, invisible in public briefings and absent from headlines, but its impact reached far across the continent. Meanwhile, the courier who had taken the photographs never learned of the effect her work had. Her mission report simply noted that the film had successfully reached London. She continued her assignments, navigating the gray, watchful silence of occupation with the same steady resolve. But in the rooms where generals pored over maps and analysts calculated enemy supply patterns, her images became one more thread woven into the Allied strategy, one more small but critical step toward loosening the iron network of German logistics. The miniature camera's greatest triumph was not in any single photograph, but in the pattern of intelligence it enabled. Again and again, its silent shutter captured fragments of truth that slipped past German scrutiny. And from these fragments, the Allied command built decisions that would shape the next phase of the war. When the film from a miniature camera reached the intelligence rooms of London, and its details began influencing Allied strategy, it became clear that such devices had earned a place far beyond their size. Their quiet contributions were never meant to be celebrated. They worked in the shadows, supporting a larger network of intelligence efforts that included aerial reconnaissance, decrypted signals, resistance reports, and escaped prisoners' testimonies. But within this vast web, the miniature camera carved out a unique role. It offered a rare form of closeness, an intimacy with enemy infrastructure that no aircraft flying at 15,000 feet could ever capture. Its images revealed the texture of the war at ground level. The condition of tracks, the signage on buildings, the precise models of locomotives under repair, even the expressions on workers' faces as they moved through the depot. These details, trivial to the untrained eye, were invaluable to analysts who pieced together the German war machine one mechanism at a time. The information gained from these tiny cameras did not operate in isolation. Rather, it fortified the intelligence chain that MI9 and SOE were constantly building. Ground photographs confirmed or corrected what was seen from the sky. They helped identify patterns that code breakers at Bletchley Park later recognized in intercepted messages. They offered clues that resistance groups used to time sabotage operations, often striking at moments when German efficiency was most vulnerable. In this way, the miniature cameras became silent partners in efforts that stretched across occupied Europe. Their contributions were rarely recorded in official documents. Mission logs often referred to them only as special equipment or optical aid. But generals and planners understood their value. In briefings held in underground rooms beneath Whitehall, analysts regularly presented enlarged frames from sub-miniature film rolls, pointing out findings that shaped British decisions in the weeks and months that followed. One of the most significant impacts of these devices lay in their ability to support escape and evasion networks. MI9 relied heavily on visual intelligence to develop safe routes, identify hidden dangers, and understand how German patrols shifted across cities and countryside. Photographs taken with miniature cameras gave escape line organizers precise knowledge of guard posts, warehouse layouts, and checkpoints. This allowed them to guide downed Allied airmen through dangerous areas with far greater confidence. Even a single image showing the direction a sentry faced or the timing of a gate closure could determine whether an airman survived his journey back to England. The cameras became part of the larger toolkit MI9 used, alongside compasses disguised as buttons, maps printed on silk, razors that concealed files, and playing cards that peeled apart to reveal escape instructions. Although the overall scale of miniature camera use cannot be measured precisely, secrecy, destruction of equipment, and sparse documentation ensure that there is little doubt that dozens, if not hundreds, of missions across Europe benefited from their discreet presence. Their deployment was always selective, aimed at moments when human intelligence could achieve what larger machines could not. And while not every mission succeeded, the cumulative effect was undeniable. They sharpened Allied understanding of German logistics, helped resistance groups refine their plans, and gave analysts in London the missing angles needed to foresee German movements. Despite their importance, the miniature cameras never became symbols of the war. There are no speeches about them, no propaganda or reels showing their use. Their role was intentionally invisible. They served a war in which victory was determined as much by unseen actions as by open battles. Their success depended on remaining unnoticed, uncelebrated, and underestimated, just as the engineers intended. But their story did not end with the war's operational necessity. As 1944 turned into 1945 and Allied forces advanced across Europe, the need for such devices diminished. Yet their influence lingered in the decisions that shaped the final years of the conflict. Quiet as they were, the miniature cameras had helped restore Britain's eyes across a continent darkened by occupation. And in those final years, the intelligence they provided contributed to a growing momentum, one that would soon turn the tide irreversibly against the Reich. When the war finally lurched toward its closing chapters and Allied armies liberated the towns and rail hubs that once required covert photography, the miniature cameras that had served so quietly began to disappear into the drifting aftermath of victory. Many were left behind in safe houses abandoned in haste when front lines shifted. Others remained in the personal belongings of agents who never returned home, their stories sealed within boxes of effects delivered to grieving families. Some devices were dismantled by engineers eager to study their own wartime creations, while others lingered for decades in drawers and attics, until discovered by descendants who had no idea that the cheap-looking trinket in their hands had once been a weapon. The wartime secrecy surrounding these cameras ensured that, unlike radio sets, codebooks, or firearms, they never received a place in popular memory. They faded instead into the background, just as they had always been designed to do. In the years after the war, museums and collectors began piecing together fragments of this hidden history. Subminiature cameras, once overlooked as novelties, suddenly became items of curiosity. Auction houses occasionally listed battered matchbox-sized devices with little provenance, but sharp-eyed historians recognized certain mechanical signatures or lens types associated with wartime British craftsmanship. A few rare examples found their way into institutions like the Imperial War Museum, where researchers examined them alongside escape gadgets, forged passports, and the silk maps MI9 had made famous. Yet even in museum cases, the cameras retained their deceptive aura. Visitors often mistook them for children's toys or fashion accessories, unaware that each had once been carried into danger by someone who depended on its unremarkable appearance for survival. The stories that resurfaced after the war tended to come not from official archives, but from aging veterans who finally felt free to speak. Former SOE instructors recalled long nights testing prototypes, dropping them from pockets to ensure they wouldn't break, or firing shutters beside ticking clocks to measure their silence. Resistance members remembered couriers arriving at safe houses with tiny devices wrapped in cloth, their faces pale from the risks taken to deliver a few grainy frames of intelligence. Some spoke of missions where the photographs made the difference between action and restraint, where a single capture detail revealed that a sabotage train would also carry forced laborers, prompting a resistance team to delay their attack. In these accounts, the miniature cameras emerged not as dramatic tools of espionage, but as instruments of moral precision, helping operatives navigate the harsh ambiguities of war. With time, the cameras became relics not just of clandestine engineering, but of a style of intelligence work that faded after 1945. As Cold War surveillance evolved, the field shifted toward electronic devices and long-range optics that bore little resemblance to the humble instruments forged in those early workshops. Yet the legacy of the miniature cameras endured in subtler ways. Their success demonstrated that intelligence did not always rely on advanced machinery or grand operations. Sometimes it depended on a device so small, so ordinary, that it could sit unnoticed on a table during a search and still carry information powerful enough to influence the outcome of battles hundreds of miles away. Even today, when historians revisit the vast mosaic of Allied intelligence, the miniature cameras remain quiet footnotes. They rarely headline exhibitions or documentaries. Their impact is measured not by dramatic missions, but by the countless small insights they provided, insights that filled the gaps between aerial photographs, decoded messages, and eyewitness reports. They were tools for precision in a chaotic world, designed to be forgotten even as they shaped decisions that moved the war toward its end. And so, in the final tally, their legacy is neither loud nor grand. It is whispered in the margins of intelligence files, hinted at in faded labels on museum shelves, and remembered in the dim recollections of those who once carried them beneath their coats. These tiny devices, born from ordinary objects and disguised as trivial toys, stand as reminders that even the smallest tools can leave deep marks on history, marks visible only when one looks closely enough. In the long shadow of the Second World War, it is often the thunder of artillery and the sweep of armored divisions that dominate the memory of the conflict. We remember vast fleets, decisive battles, and the machinery of destruction that reshaped continents. Yet beneath that immense narrative lies a quieter truth. Victory was also shaped by tools small enough to hide in the palm of a hand. The miniature cameras engineered in Britain were never meant to inspire awe or fear. They were meant to be overlooked, passed by, disregarded. And in that invisibility, they achieved a form of influence that belied their fragile frames. Their power came not from force, but from clarity, from their ability to capture small moments of truth in a world overwhelmed by deception and control. These devices remind us that war is rarely defined solely by the scale of its violence. It is also defined by human creativity, by the persistence of individuals who search for solutions where none seem to exist. Engineers who once built novelty gadgets repurposed their craft to serve a nation in peril. Couriers and agents risked everything to carry tiny strips of film across borders alive with danger. And analysts in dim laboratories pieced together the images to understand an enemy that sought to hide behind blackout curtains and barbed wire. In each link of this chain, the miniature camera served as a silent witness to courage, patience, and ingenuity. Looking back now, the irony is unmistakable. The cameras were designed to appear trivial, yet their legacy endures precisely because of the weight they carried in secret. They captured fragments of history that would have otherwise vanished into the fog of occupation, details that informed decisions far beyond the streets where the shutters clicked. In a conflict defined by vast industrial might, these tiny instruments prove that influence is not always proportional to size. Sometimes the decisive advantage comes from the subtle, the overlooked, the small. And so their story becomes a reminder woven into the larger fabric of the war. Even in the darkest moments of global conflict, it is often the smallest sparks of ingenuity and bravery that illuminate the path forward.